The new girl. On Monday morning, there was a new girl in Jane's class. She stood at the front beside Mrs. Burrows. "Everyone," said Mrs. Burrows, "this is Stafford. She's spending a few weeks with us until the end of term." "How do you do?" Stafford said. Everyone stared. Jane thought Stafford was the oddest girl she had ever seen. She must have been 11, like the rest of the class, but she was as small as an 8-year-old and very skinny. She had 2 plaits. They were long, of shiny black hair. Her skin was paper white, and you could see the blue veins in her spindly little arms. She wore a stiff dress of dark red velvet, white socks, and polished black shoes. Jane thought she looked like one of those old-fashioned children in the books about Second World War. Ellie and Angie, the 2 other girls in the class, had started tittering behind their hands. Stafford stared right back, not at all shy. She looked carefully at every face in the room. This did not take long. Lower Lumpton Primary was a very small school in a very small town that was really a large village. There were only 10 children in the whole of the Year 6. "Welcome to our school, Stafford," said Mrs. Burrows. "Why don't you tell us something about yourself?" "There's not much to tell," Stafford said. "I was brought up in a very remote place in far north. My mother and I are travelling around the country on an annual tour of interesting places. We're resting here for a while before we make our long journey home, and I'm hoping to make a new best friend." Stafford's voice was babyish and squeaky, but she spoke like a posh, rather nutty old lady. She sounded hilarious, and the whole class was giggling. Jane tried to keep a straight face, because it felt mean to laugh at someone new, but even Mrs. Burrows was smiling. "Thank you, Stafford. I'm sure you'll make lots of new friends." "Oh, I'm only looking for one," Stafford said. The giggles got louder. "Settle down," warned Mrs. Burrows. Stafford did not seem to care about being laughed at. She smiled graciously. "Please don't worry about me, Mrs. Burrows. My life has been rich and varied, and I'm quite used to these new experiences. Shall I sit next to the boy with red hair?" "Boy with... Oh, you mean Jane!" The class exploded into a roar of laughter. Jane felt that if she blushed any harder, her ears would catch fire. This weird new girl had mistaken her for a boy and mentioned her hair. She couldn't have said anything worse. The 2 things Jane hated most about her life were her red hair and the fact that she had to wear boys' clothes. "Jane's certainly not a boy," Miss Burrows said, with a kind look at Jane and a stern look at the rest of the class. "I expect you thought she was a boy because she has her lovely hair tied back." "But she's dressed as a boy," Stafford said. She pointed at Jane's Man-U sweatshirt. "She's wearing some sort of football costume." That was another burst of laughter. The boys at the back shouted, "Football costume!" in silly, posh voices. Miss Burrows told them to shut up, but she was laughing too. "I don't know where you've been for the past 50 years, Stafford. These days it's perfectly normal for girls to wear football stuff. Look!" She put her foot on a chair, hitched up her trouser leg, and showed the class her Arsenal sock. Even old lady teachers do it. The fire in Jane's face cooled. She was grateful to Mrs. Burrows for taking the tension away from her, but it wasn't much good when the new girl had to sit right beside her. It was the only empty place in the class. Stafford sat down in the empty place. "Well, this is cozy," she said. She opened an old-fashioned brown leather satchel and began unpacking pencils and paper. "Sorry, I thought you were a boy." "Right, everybody," said Mrs. Burrows. "Let's get started." "Yes, do carry on," Stafford said. "I'll soon get into the swing of things." She spoke to Mrs. Burroughs like a royal person on an official visit. Jane wished the new girl had sat somewhere else, but she couldn't help being interested in her. She was tiny, and she wore babyish clothes, yet she was not like a child. Staffa filled in her maths sheet quickly and neatly. When she handed it in at the end of the lesson, she said, "Forgive the gaps, Mrs. Burroughs. Long divisions are always my Achilles heel." At break, Staffa sat on the low playground wall. She took a thermos flask out of a satchel and poured herself a cup of strong black coffee. Jane thought it smelled disgusting. She was curious. What kind of 11-year-old drank black coffee? Ellie and Angie called Jane over to the corner of the playground. Normally, these two spent most of the time whispering together and ignoring Jane. Today, they needed her so they could whisper about Staffa. Ellie said, "You'd never get me in a dress like that. It looks like curtains." Angie said, "Her shoes are stupid too. Toddler's shoe, and she's got a stupid name." "I quite like her name," Jane said. She was surprised that she wanted to stick up for the new girl. "It's different." "Oh, like you got great taste," Ellie said scornfully. "Janie!" Jane's younger brother, Mike and Phil, yelled at her from the other side of the playground. "Come and play football. We need another man." Angie giggled. "Does Staffa know you're a girl yet?" "She thinks you're a red-haired boy," Ellie said. "She probably fancies you." Jane scowled and ran off to play football, hating Ellie and Angie. She could swear they get sillier every year. All they talked about was clothes and makeup. If only the new girl had been someone she could talk to sensibly. But Staffa didn't seem to want to talk at all. She spent the rest of the break sipping coffee and looking at her watch. When they returned to the classroom, she yawned and stared out of the window. At break, she turned to Jane. "I assume the smell of boiled socks is our midday meal." This made Jane smile. The school lunch did smell rather like boiled socks. "It's okay when you eat it," she said. "I'll show you where we go." Someone had to look after Staffa. "And I suppose it'll have to be me," Jane thought crossly, "because there isn't anyone else. Just my luck to get lumbered with the oddball." She led Staffa into the lunch hall. Staffa immediately went over to one of the long tables and sat down. "Is there a menu?" she asked, "or does one ask the waiting woman?" Jane swallowed a snort of laughter. She did not believe this girl. Staffa was lucky nobody else had heard her. "We don't sit down until we got our food," she explained. "We have to line up at the hatch." Staffa was fascinated. She loved standing in line. She loved watching the dinner ladies as they spooned out chicken nuggets, baked beans, and mountains of chips. She loved the school chips. "These chipped potatoes are delicious, and how clever to put sauce bottles next to knives and forks." Jane wondered what kind of school staff had come from. It must have been a very fancy school, she thought, if it really did have menus and waiting women. "This is a highly efficient way of feeding large numbers of people," piped Staffa. "I must tell my mother. She's always trying to cut costs in the servants' canteen." Jane wished Staffa would stop talking. Couldn't she see that everyone else at the table was staring and whispering behind their hands? It was very embarrassing.